Hello and welcome to Harvest of Harvo. This is February, which means I'm going to try to read a book a day and also do a quick review of it. This is my stack back here, and with the help of new equipment, this trendy lapel mic, and a train ticket that was purchased in April of 2014, I will be able to record wherever I want, and hopefully I won't fall behind. The goal is to actually read a novel every day and to do a review of it on the same day. In previous times that I've done this challenge, I have been a bit slack and I have complained, and this year I just feel really excited. I feel like I am keen to read all of these books, and I will get through as many as I can in as brisk of a time as I can, starting with number one, Breakfast at Tiffany's. This is a reread, and it's a book that I read first in, I think, 2018 or so. I just wanted something really short that I could finish in a short amount of time, and I feel the same this way. So it is about, I would say, 30,000, 40,000 words long. It is about a man who moves to this apartment block in New York and meets this woman named Holly Golightly. She is this socialite with a lot of male suitors, and at first it seems like it's going to be a bit of a manic pixie dream girl kind of story, but Holly Golightly is actually very aware of this role that she has and this mystique that she plays about herself. Like, she's very in control of her own image, and it's a novel that is fascinated with her and her constructed identity and how she finds enjoyment and meaning in her life by doing that, but also in the narrator being this aspiring writer and his desire to try and express the life of this person that he comes to really care about. I love this novella. I love this so much. I think the writing style is just really beautiful. Actually, it's funny to me because the first time I read it, I must have missed out on a lot of plot points. Like, there's a lot of plot elements that I just don't remember, and this time reading it, I think, wow, that's really a thing that happens in this book. But I don't think what happens is the main point. I think what I really like about this book is just the sentences themselves and how they construct character and just how warm you feel by the end of it. Even though there are characters who are not great people and they do quite bad things, it's a book where you feel the care the author has in another human being. And that's just a really, really remarkable thing. I give it a 5 out of 5. Lots of caveats about it, but I really like it. And I have a list of my top 50 books in the spreadsheet that I have on this channel, and this I want to move up after reading it a second time. I want to put it in, if not my top 10, then my top 5. I really, really like it. Bright Lights, Big City by J. McInerney, oh goodness, this is a bad idea, is a book that I thought I would dislike, and for a while I did quite dislike. So it is about a publishing worker in New York in the 1980s who is kind of distraught. So he's had a failed marriage, and his wife has run away to be a model in Europe. And so he's got this one friend who is this horrible influence. He takes him out to clubs and takes drugs and just has a very unfulfilling life. And he's just kind of really hung up about this marriage that hasn't worked out. And at the same time, he's working at this magazine as a fact checker. And I can't believe this job used to exist, because his main work is to accept articles, like non-fiction articles, from authors and to just research and make sure all their facts are correct. And that's just his full-time job. I just, having never lived in the 1980s, having never lived through like a pre-internet world, I just cannot imagine actually doing that. Like that's just amazing to me. But the real challenge of this book is that it's just so disaffected and kind of bleak and sardonic. Like, it's written in second person, and so it feels very accusatory. It feels very much like Catcher in the Rye kind of story, where we have this protagonist who's a bit unlikable and is going his way through New York and just kind of getting beat down by society. And I have a hard time feeling sorry for these characters, because I'm like, but you're in this big city, you're in this privileged group, and you're educated, you have this job that is meaningful to you, and all of this is kind of at your fingertips, and you're sad. So the first, at least 2/3 of this book I really didn't like, but then I was surprised, because J. McInerney brings this story to a sense of sensibility that I really wasn't expecting. And there was a sentimentality and a tenderness that was made so much stronger by just how abrasive the start was. And so I think that's quite effective. I didn't hate it, but it's also, like, it's one of those books that's kind of left to history, really. It was a bestseller when it first came out, and it really launched J. McInerney's career. It really launched the careers of a lot of authors writing this style, like Bret Easton Ellis and Chuck Palahnuik, and it's fine. Like, it is interesting to read as a historical footnote, but also, what else are you reading this book for? I don't really know. I give it a 3 out of 5. Out for a walk by the bay today, and it's a lovely day, but a bit too hot, so I'm hiding in the shade. A few more books to catch up on. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson is a sort of autobiographical, sort of fairy tale type novel. I'd read Passion by her previously, and I really enjoyed just how detailed and whimsical and historical it was. And this, to me, is a lot more personal. It's about a young girl who's adopted, growing up in a conservative Christian household, and having the realization that she is queer, that she is attracted to another woman in the church. And so they explore romantic territory whilst their church is visited by this traveling pastor who has this theology of demons and is worried about people who appear very devout and very devoted to the faith actually being, I guess in his words, evil, or his words, possessed. So it's a novel that kind of just works the way that it says it's going to work. It's about fairy tales, and it's about reality. It's about growing up, and it's quite emotionally effective. It doesn't surprise me, but it's also about a topic on itself, on its own, that is so detailed and emotional. And I think it hits all the notes very well. It makes me feel empathy for a situation that I'll never be in. And I think that I will continue to remember a story like this, so I will give it a 4 out of 5. There's going to be a lot of 4 out of 5s this year. The Sirens of Titan by Vonnegut is such a fast novel and such a chaotic novel. It is about so many things. It is about a man who's a space traveler, and he gets sucked into this interdimensional thing that means that he materializes on Earth once every couple of months, I believe. And it also gives him circular knowledge and predetermined knowledge of all the events in the universe. So he's able to know exactly what's going to happen before it happens, and he chooses to use this power to allow one of the richest futures traders, like speculative market traders in the world, to travel to Mars and take on this whole new identity and personality, and then reshape the history of humanity by starting this war. And it's just all very detailed and complicated. So much happens. It's really hard to describe what the plot of this book is. And I think Vonnegut's work is really interested in determinism and fate and the meaning of life, but it's also very funny. It's also very irreverent. So I usually read a Douglas Adams novel every February, and this is kind of my surrogate for that. This is Vonnegut's second novel, and you can see his style start to take shape here. You can see what will eventually become something like Slaughterhouse 5, but here is just... I still feel like the characters are representative of something. I still feel like they're trying to... Or they're represented as people who are the results of certain political attitudes or certain economic forces, but they don't feel like people to me. Like, they don't feel like someone that I'm really going to empathize with, that I feel their happiness and I feel their sadness. Whereas what made Slaughterhouse 5 so amazing to me was that it did have this science fiction high concept, and it did have this pointed anti-war and political message, but it was also very human to its protagonist. And that's, I think, the missing ingredient here, is that I think that the science here is really fascinating. The tone is really humorous and also really dramatic. The plot is just so quick and well-paced. The writing style is easy to get into. The characters are fun. I just didn't get that emotional hit that I was searching for. So I would give this a 4 out of 5. But I think it's valuable reading for Vonnegut's style, and I think it's so influential to think of it as a science fiction novel from 1959, and it was able to not predict, but follow or codify so many things that I think we take for granted in science fiction today. I think that's really cool. 7 Empty Houses by Samanta Schweblin is a series of short stories that are... To call them horror would be a bit oversimplifying them, I think. It is it's from an Argentinian author, and it is exploring the safety that we feel in our houses and our neighborhoods, and how we often know much less than we think we do, that our assumptions of our neighbors and our family and our friends are sometimes incorrect, and that the people that we put our trust in and we think should be able to protect us are sometimes not able to. And when in those moments, we're really lost. Like, we see scenes that we don't understand. We see events that disturb us or shock us with their banality. Like, it's not events presented in a way that's going to make us feel scared. Instead, it's events presented as if they're just ordinary things that happen, and we have to reckon with the fact that to us, they're horrific. To us, they really dig at our deepest fears and uncertainties. But to these characters, they're just an ordinary day. They're just an ordinary day in a house that's always been there. So it's called the core conceit for many of these stories. I was really drawn to the longest one, which is about an older woman who is aware that she's going to pass away soon, and so she's packing up all her belongings. And the fact that she's about to die, I think, leads her to this quite fatalistic attitude towards her husband and her neighbors. She doesn't care if they are happy or they do well or anything like that. She is focused just on herself because she doesn't see her impact or influence in the world lasting for much longer. And it ends up with this sad and mysterious story, but also just the feeling of, over a longer period of time, discovering what's happening and what the problem is really fascinating to me. So I think some of the shorter stories, I think, get to that shock moment just a bit too early, whereas having that slow burn was really valuable. And I'm looking forward to reading Fever Dream. I'm looking forward to reading her work at a novel length. This would be, I think, a 3 out of 5 for me. The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis is a novel and sort of religious tract. It's an epistolary story about two demons talking to one another. Screwtape, who is a more experienced demon, talking to Wormwood, and he's sending these letters about how to tempt a individual away from Christianity and away from belief and claim their soul for their father, the devil. It is a kind of satirical book. It is looking at, ultimately, morality in society, but in a lens that approaches C.S. Lewis's particular view of Christianity, which in some ways, I think the intention is to be quite apolitical. And this is just from what I understand from reading Mere Christianity, and I enjoy his works. I enjoy the Narnia books, and I feel like Mere Christianity was well articulated, but I don't really like the Screwtape Letters very much. And I think that what really grinds with me about this book is, well, the main thing is the political elements, but I think structurally there's already this problem of the demons being kind of inconsistent in their motivations. Like, what do they gain from tempting someone away from God? And how can a book that is religious and by a religious author and intending to encourage its readers to be more devout, how can a book like that be from the perspective of characters who are against the belief that it espouses? And how can demons simultaneously kind of recognize the goodness of God, but also fight against God? I think there's just this odd contradiction that's so present across all of these letters. And I just never felt it got reconciled. I think if I had to think about it, like, the real cipher for this book is to be Christian, and it is to already believe in the things that it says are good and to be believed in. And at that point, you can kind of ignore some of the contradictions that exist here. But even kind of me being aware of Christian theology and being aware of what this book is trying to do, I still think it doesn't land. And also the politics and element of things is that it's written with the very clear memory and knowledge of World War I and World War II, C.S. Lewis having served in that conflict. And it's trying to argue against a historicity view of literature where he doesn't want to... Well, the demons express that both pacifism and patriotism to your country are valid ways to turn someone away from faith. And I just feel like, with the hindsight of things, like, now that we can look back at World War I and World War II for historical events, this is a book that is very built in that time. And even though the book itself tells you to, or like in a spiritual way, to avoid historicity and avoid putting things into context, like, you can't not put this into context, right? Especially when it has such tightly wound scenes of military combat, of the draft, of the Blitz. I just feel like if you want to read it and understand it and gain something for yourself, you have to ignore a lot of what it's trying to say. So where do I stand with this? I think I give it, it's teetering between a 3 out of 5 and a 2 out of 5. This edition also comes with Screwtape Proposes a Toast, which is this addendum article that he published, which is more about education and democracy and equality. And that one, I think, is where the whole like apolitical religion thing goes out the window. It is very clearly espousing a particular political view, and it also kind of soured my view of the book as a whole. It just doesn't align with, how do I phrase this? It doesn't align with my belief system. But it is also a book which is written in such a way that I feel like you'd only really enjoy it if it does align with your belief system. And that, I think, does push me into a 2 out of 5. Like, it's unfortunate because I think I do really enjoy Narnia. I do really enjoy these fantastical views. And I think maybe this isn't the book that C.S. Lewis is the best at writing. I think he's so much more successful in a more personal and a much more kind of hopeful lens, that when we approach a topic like damnation, I don't know, it just doesn't work for me. The Woman Warrior by Maxine Kingston is a personal memoir about it's one of the very first Chinese American works of literature to really put it down for the culture. That's only slightly true. It's one of the first to gain this national and international recognition. It was the book that I think you find very commonly taught on university syllabuses or on high school syllabuses. It's a book that has been used to teach and express Chinese American culture. And I think whenever a work becomes that, whenever it takes that role of speaking for a particular demographic or a diaspora, the amount of expectation placed on it is enormous. And so I'm not surprised that there's this huge array of criticism, both positive and negative, towards it. But just from my reading of it, my interpretation, it's so personal. It's such a reflection on one individual's upbringing and experience with their family. And it really isn't trying to be a definitive story about what it's like to be Chinese American. I think that the real tragedy of this book is that people did try to make it something that it's not trying to be. And if I read it as just this very clear personal story, it's very easy to forgive the, let's say, inaccuracies, because my life and upbringing is nothing like the upbringing of Maxine Kingston. But I appreciate so much being able to see what life was like for her. And I appreciate being able to compare and contrast and see how some things have changed and how some things stay the same. I find it interesting the way that there's arguments made about embellishment of stories, but that's entirely what this book is trying to do, is that it's using Chinese folk tales and exaggerating elements of her family history in order to make this argument about, in order to kind of tell the story that she wants to tell, to express the identity that she sees for herself. And I guess the argument is that difference is there, that you can't assimilate or homogenize people because they are going to have these experiences and upbringings that are going to be different. And to make this argument for the validity of her identity, using folk tales and using these experiences as a Chinese American woman, I think it's good. I think it's something that should be remembered, and it is rightfully one of the seminal works of Chinese American literature. So I'm glad that this book is very easily available, and I love also the introduction by Xiaolu Guo. I just enjoy the place of this in the wider conversation, and absolutely Chinese American literature would not be the same without the contributions of this. I give it a 4 out of 5 for my enjoyment of reading it. I think that the structure is actually kind of hard to grasp because it's 5 not really linked essays, storytelling. You never really know what you're about to get, and it oscillates between this child's voice that doesn't fully understand what's going on around it, but also this very wise, older understanding and hindsight trying to create a book that is meant to be studied, it is meant to be read in great detail. So it's trying to be those two spheres, and I think it succeeds in both sides. You can read it enjoyably as a childhood memoir, or you can read it quite enjoyably as an academic work that's trying to explore more of diasporic literature. And it's one that fits well, of course, within a much larger diet of both Chinese American and Chinese diaspora and Chinese and all sorts of literature in the world. Like, it's a good book if you want to read a lot of books across your life. And of course, there are dangers if this is the only book you choose to read about Chinese American culture. And that's kind of what I have to say about it. Okay, we're going to have to knock off a few in a row, but some of these are very, very good. We'll start with 5 Bells by Gail Jones. This one I tried to be cheeky and record it at the Opera House where the book is set, but the audio from that is just completely unusable, so just have some clips of the harbor here and know that I tried. But this is a book that is set around Circular Quay. It is about 4 characters that variously intersect. We have Ellie and James, who are reuniting as adults after having a brief romance as teenagers. We have Pei Xing, who is a Chinese Australian woman who has escaped the Cultural Revolution. And we have Catherine, who is someone who's migrating from, or I think just visiting from Ireland. And each of these characters have their various histories and desires, and they're all united by this physical space of the harbor. And it really seems to me as a book that's trying to aestheticize Sydney Harbour, that's trying to make it significant and meaningful for the people who visit there. And I find it really interesting because I do have a connection to the harbour. Like, my grandfather took me there nearly every day when I was growing up because he used to like fishing in the pier there. And so I'm very familiar with the space. But to me, it's also just a building, and the bridge is just a bridge. Like, there's nothing really so magical about it that it warrants this degree of really lavish prose, which is what this book is really doing. Is it's trying to be beautiful, and it's trying to show you these characters having their most meaningful life moments unfolding because of this experience of the harbor. And it just doesn't really tie together. Like, to me, it's trying to be something like a Mrs. Dalloway type story, but it doesn't have the time or space to actually give a full life story of each of these characters. And Pei Xing, the character who I think should be, like, is the most interesting. Like, she has a story of migration, she has a story of reuniting with past trauma and coming to terms with how everything's changed so much in her life. Like, she, to me, has the most unique and meaningful story, but it's also a story that I really wonder what rights this novel has to tell it and to rush it in such a way. I don't really know, and I think I just felt very conflicted about this novel. I give it a 3 out of 5. I think, unfortunately, it's kind of emblematic of a trend that I see in contemporary Australian fiction, is that it loves literature, it loves referencing big novels. It references Dr. Zhivago, it references Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Doesn't expect you to have read them or understand them. It's more the fact that it wants you to feel literary. It wants to be a novel that is aesthetically beautiful, but not necessarily one that really means anything. It's just people and places and beautiful words, and that's kind of it. I feel bad to criticize it in this way, but it's also like, I don't really gain anything out of reading this, and I would feel really bad if this was what was the most emblematic of Australian literature. The Swimmers by Julie Otsuka is an amazing book. Oh my goodness. So the premise of this book, and it's very formally experimental. The first 2 of the 5 sections are about a swimming pool that is this enclosed environment. It's written in first-person collective, so we did this and we did that. We have characters who treat this pool as this sanctuary, this refuge, this place where underwater they can be their true selves, or at least not be constrained by gravity, by the world around them. And the prose is so beautiful, and it's just like so freeing that I'm just levitating as I'm reading this. It's just so, so wonderful. It's not aestheticism for aestheticism's sake. It's aestheticism to show really the freedom that we all desire as human beings. This space that transcends what life experience could be. And then in section 3, 4, and 5, it just absolutely goes to tear your heart out. It is just a ruthlessly sad human book that is so clear about our joys and our desires and our limitations and our mortality. It's just so well done. It's very personal to the author's life as well, and it's just it loves its characters so much, it loves its setting so much, it loves language so much. Like, every section gets you to try and figure out what it is, and it uses different techniques and structures and perspectives in order to do that, and it's just an amazing ride the whole way through. It's a 5 out of 5, but also by the end, like, I was looking away from the book. It was horrifyingly sad. It's a 5 out of 5, but also, how dare you? Fight Club by Chuck Palahnuik is a good book. It's so hard to talk about it without talking about the cultural influence that it has, and also the film. To me, this is one of those books that is really worsened by the fact that the film adaptation is just much, much better at doing what it's trying to do. And I feel this way about Life of Pi, I feel this way about lots of other books, but Fight Club especially, as I was reading this, I was just imagining Brad Pitt and Edward Norton. Like, I could just see them in my head. And I was wondering, if I didn't see the film first, then what visual language did this book give me to really envisage and feel these spaces and events and situations? And it's not very vivid. I think the narration of this book is a very particular choice, and it's there to try and get you into the emotional headspace of the protagonist, which is this very dry and acidic, razor-sharp kind of mindset where he has been not sleeping well for weeks and weeks, and he's just in a horrible emotional state. And so you feel that emptiness and nothingness through everything. That doesn't necessarily make a very vivid reading, but it does help you read it very fast. And so it does shuttle you through the various plot elements. It is pretty close to the film, I will say, but the ending's a bit different. And I do like to theorize and think about the things that did make it into the film and the things that didn't. I think ultimately it works well as a thriller. It works well as this kind of black, dark satire comedy. Does it work well as social commentary? I don't know, because there's a great afterword in this book from Chuck Palahnuik, which is referencing and reflecting on the various commercial and cultural successes that this story has had since it's come out. It's about a bit more than 20 years old now. But I do think about, ultimately, yes, it meant a lot of things to a lot of people, especially men, at a particular time in history. But the disaffected young male novel about trying to find your place and community in the world, and doing so through various transgressive acts, like, that's been around for centuries. That's, like, even since Catcher in the Rye and every book that came after it. Like, this is not even the first book I've read this month that has that theme. So what does the book have other than its transgressiveness and its style? I can't really say much other than it's saying something that seems to be deeply seated in young male fiction forever. But I give it a look at the 3 out of 5. I think it's such an interesting way to tell a story, but as an actual thematic story, and to also break it down in terms of its plot to sequencing and its twists, like, it's fine. I think it's hard. It doesn't hit me with the surprise that the film did, and even I think I was spoiled before I watched the film, so the power is gone a little bit for me. But speaking of power, The Moon is Down by John Steinbeck. So this is a collection of John Steinbeck's shorter novels. It contains 7 books, and it is a fantastic find that I got at a used bookstore. I think it was like 50, 60, maybe 7 years old. But The Moon is Down is a novella about a small town in Europe that is being invaded by this military force. And it was then written as an allegory for World War II and German occupation of Norway, but because it's stripped away of its actual historical significance, and I think it's doing that for quite a purpose in order to say something much broader about the act of invasion and occupation, this is like a tremendously relevant book for today. Like, I genuinely was shook reading the entire way through, because I was thinking, like, I'm seeing this in the news. I'm seeing this being talked about in this country of Australia, where we are talking about invasion days and of various conflicts around the world, in Palestine and in Gaza, in Ukraine, in just thinking about the way that an invading force and the people and the land that they occupy have this caustic relationship, and yet the way that we treat other human beings. Because at the end of the day, and I think what this book gets really well, is that both the invaders and the occupied are human beings. And the occupied are going to resist. There is a a very well described process of how and why resistance movements form in any kind of occupied space. And it's a really nuanced exploration to how morality enables resistance and almost kind of justifies violent resistance, but also how invading forces can twist morality and even arrive with this twist of morality to justify the actions they take to invade as well. And I think it's just very meaningfully done. It's so hard because, I mean, it raises so many questions that unfortunately just haven't really been answered. Like, I would imagine when writing this that Steinbeck was hoping that there would not ever be a war of invasion and occupation ever after World War II. I was hoping then an entire possibility, and I think growing up in a very naive 2000s context, I was thinking of the same possibility as well. And so to see these repeating patterns throughout history echoing of what it means to be occupied and what it means to be the occupier, and relating that to my own Australian and Chinese context of various histories of both being occupied and occupying and having all those various identities and having to reconcile the morality behind each of these, this book is just such a good one to read. It made me think so much more deeply about things that I already care about, and I care about more for having read and analyzed this, and I will certainly be returning to it many, many times. I really like John Steinbeck as an author, and I'm so surprised that I can still find, I guess, lesser-known works of his that talk about things that I would never have expected him to talk about, and still, like, be so on the mark with what I'm thinking about in terms of life and existence and all of those things in between. It is a 5 out of 5 for sure. Also a tremendously compelling read. I was surprised at just how well-paced it is, how surprisingly beautiful some of the speeches are as well. Like, it doesn't feel like you're reading a political or a military textbook. Like, it's just genuinely a great work of art, in addition to being such a meaningful thematic work as well. Whew, okay, so we are about halfway through. It is the 12th of February as I'm recording this, and I've read 11 books, so I am one behind. There are a few shorter ones that I've left towards the end of the month as a bit of a stopgap, so I do feel like I will complete it, and I'm glad this time that it is mostly novels so far. It's mostly novels and short story collections. I haven't been cheating with poetry collections or anything like that. I am enjoying it a lot more this time. I think I've been picking out books that I've been looking forward to reading, and it's just good. Like, I love being able to jostle around and read lots of different styles and authors and time periods. I think that's what makes reading really rewarding for me, is to see that the world is changing and to see that there are so many different ways of looking at everything. And you only really get that from reading a large amount of books in a small amount of time. So far it's good. I am still losing sleep. My skin is still a lot worse than it was last month, but I'm enjoying myself. Tinkers by Paul Harding is a good book. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner, and it's a deathbed novel, so I wasn't really sure how I was going to feel going into it, because I've read a few sad books so far in this challenge, and I mean, I think Tinkers is well expressed. It, to me, reads very much like a kind of prose poem. Like, it's just really beautiful. All the phrases and sentences are being written in a way to be very aesthetic, and so I feel like that beauty in some ways lessens the tragic subject matter. We follow a father and a son. So the son is an old man on his deathbed, and he's imagining or experiencing his father existing there and being able to share this space together, given that as a child he had this very traumatic memory of his father who suffers from seizures, and the son also suffers from seizures. There was the discovery of the father, I guess, his fallibility and his also kind of his danger towards his child. And so from there, we have this really muted story about this community in Maine throughout the early 1900s, and just life there and the environment and this recurring motif of clocks. It's one of those books where I think if you came to get a literary novel, this is what you get. Like, there's not that much remarkable about it. I think it's just a good example of a book that's just tying together a very universal theme that we've never really figured out, and well-written sentences, well-constructed symbols. It's a 4 out of 5, but I wanted that kind of magical feeling, and I didn't get it as deeply as I have from some other novels, but there are definitely phrases and pages that I thought, wow, this is really incredible writing. Hello, we are recording from Adelaide, and it's beautiful. The sun is just about to set. I'm going to be in this hotel room for the next couple of days, and we are going to be doing mostly ebooks because I didn't want to take a bunch of novellas with me on this trip. But Staying On is unfortunately not a beautiful book. It is a novel about, well, it's one of those Booker Prize novels about the end of the British Empire in India. There's quite a few of these, and it's written by a white author. So I read The Siege of Krishnapur last year, I think, and it was okay, it was fine. Like, for a white person writing about India, it was pretty balanced towards the Indian characters, and I think having read that first, Staying On is a bit worse by comparison. So Paul Scott has written a quartet of novels about British colonial India, and the end of that, called the Raj Quartet, and Staying On is kind of this weird epilogue of that. So it's got some characters from that series. I don't really know what it's trying to do very much, because it's got two English characters, and they're these people who have decided to stay in India after the rest of the British Empire has left. And so they're kind of stuck here economically because they can't go back to England and enjoy the same kind of lifestyle or luxury they would have previously in colonial British India. And yet in now independent India, they're kind of being jostled around by the powers that be, because of course now being white gives them no real privilege or advantage in society. And it's just very hard for me to feel sympathy for these characters. Like, the book clearly does want me to feel sad about the fact that these characters don't have a good standard of living and they don't have a lot of hope in their lives. Like, they're getting a bit older as well. And that is, like, generally a sad thing, but they're also just facing the consequences of colonialism. And I'm just like, tough, you know, like, too bad, so sad. I wonder if it's written in a time and for an audience that still laments British colonial India as like either a good or at least a neutral thing. Whereas for me reading this today, like, I don't know what to do with it. I would give it a 2 out of 5. It's written in this very straightforward, naturalistic style that towards the very beginning I thought was honestly quite boring. And it's trying to be funny. The reviewers say that it's funny, but it does rely a little bit on really problematic caricatures about men and women and Indian characters in particular. Like, it's surprisingly nuanced with its Indian characters. It recognizes that there's different social demographics and different attitudes at play here, but it's also not above making a joke at someone's physical appearance, at their accent, as to their personality and their stereotypes. Like, it's just not that great. Daisy Miller by Henry James is, for the first 90%, an incredibly fun novel. I really enjoyed the beginning and middle of it. So we follow Mr. Winterbourne, who's holidaying in Switzerland, and he meets this young boy named Randolph, who's really like spirited and everything. And through Randolph, he meets his sister, Daisy Miller. Daisy Miller is a young woman, and Mr. Winterbourne starts falling in love with Daisy, but Daisy is this American woman who like enjoys flirting and doesn't mind playing with people's emotions. Like, she has fun playing with people's emotions. And so this ends up in what I found to be a really, really fun romance story. We have our protagonist, who is also American, but he's lived in Europe for a while. He's a bit older than Daisy, and he seems to expect that to take a position of superiority. Like, he has the moral and the cultural superiority because he's a very in Rome do what the Romans do kind of person. He thinks that in Switzerland, in Europe, that everyone's very emotionally reserved and they follow certain decorums. And later in the novel, they go to Italy. He actually kind of follows, well, not follows, but like they meet again in Italy, and they have to contend with Italian social etiquette as well. And Daisy just doesn't have any of that. Like, she just doesn't care. She likes to play around and to flirt and to go and enjoy her holiday, and all power to her. Like, I feel it's so funny because reading Henry Miller, his one preoccupation, like the one thing that he cares about the most, is changing of social dynamics and values, especially in relation to romance, because of globalization, because of America and England. And here, he does this in this really fun way. Like, he has characters who talk in a really snappy dialogue. They bounce off each other. They're really fun to watch interact. And I just enjoy Mr. Winterbourne kind of having his values upended because he just meets someone like Daisy who's so free-spirited that he doesn't really know what to do. And then the ending kind of hit me out of nowhere. I don't really get what Henry James was trying to do with this ending because it surprised me. And I was like, it's one of those endings where it's such a swerve that actually
makes me like a book less. So I was originally going to give it a 4 out of 5 as I was reading, maybe a 5 out of 5 if I stuck at the landing, but it was down to a 3 because I think as a whole cohesive work, I just can't recommend it as much as I would like to. So yeah, Daisy Miller.
Nella Larsen's Passing is a novel that I am very, very glad to have read. So the premise is that it's mostly set in Harlem, but the start is in Chicago. We have 2 young African-American women who are both able to, in their context, pass for white in their society. And so it explores the choice of one woman, Claire, to effectively pretend to be white and to marry a white man who's from South Africa. And it's in some ways a very emotionally painful book because the man that she marries absolutely hates African American people, like all dark-skinned people, and he makes fun of the concepts of African American people in front of her, and she just has to kind of deal with it. And so meeting again with a protagonist who's also a woman who can pass for white, they have to really reckon with their ideas of race and culture and what they fall back on. And what I find so interesting is that it's really a novel which to me is about how race is constructed socially, but because of the way that social constructs work, it's not just our own decision to be a particular race, but it's also the way that other people treat us. And so I, for example, could pretend that I'm not Chinese and I could succeed for myself, but I can't succeed for the world around me. And in the same sense, I think these characters in this novel are afforded this quality about themselves where they have this choice to make, and they have to think about what role does race play in their identity, and can they actually fall back on their community? Can they fall back on the fact that they were raised by African American people, and is that culture something that's going to protect them if they abandon it? I just think the conflicts that are explored here are just really, really interesting, and I'm very glad to have read this. Tremendously sad book on many an occasion. There are many chapters that are quite hard to read because of just how it kind of emotionally tears at you. It makes you really think about who you are and what choice you would make and what is the right thing to do in a certain situation. I give it a 5 out of 5. I think that if I had the chance to read this earlier in my life, I would be a much more empathetic person. And I'm honestly kind of unhappy that it took me this long to get to this. After Dark by Haruki Murakami is fine. I think so. Murakami is one of those authors that kind of has a type going for most of his books, at least his earlier ones. I've so far read Wind, Pinball, Dance, 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 and this kind of falls into that same category where it's sort of dream logic-y, surreal, nightlife, underworld kind of story. And After Dark is different because it's a more of an ensemble story, and it's in third person. It's not about one particular character. What I find about most of the Murakami novels is that they're about this feeling of chase and desire. We have characters really wanting something and maybe not knowing exactly what that thing is, but constantly having this kinetic push every chapter to move towards the next thing and to see what's happening. Whereas After Dark takes place over the course of a single night, and there's not really any core conflict to it, but it is a story where characters meet each other in strange circumstances. So we start in this Denny's and we have 2 teenagers. One's a trombone player and one's this young girl who is seems like she's running away from home. They meet under very unusual circumstances. They have this conversation that feels really stilted, and it's hard for me because I think it's like, do you give Murakami the props to say this conversation is stilted for an aesthetic purpose? Is it obeying dream logic? Is it kind of empty and unfulfilling because that's the stylistic choice? Or are those qualities, like the stilted dialogue and the empty unfeelingness and the kind of hollowness of some of the women in the story, is that a flaw or is that the style? I don't really know. And I think the more that I read his work and the more that I kind of see these patterns play out, I guess the less magical they seem to me. But for what it's worth, there are some really great conversations in After Dark at some points. You just have to kind of get to there. And you don't really know what's going to be really poignant and what's going to be really stilted. I also find it really interesting how music is a motif in this novel. I love that you can go on YouTube and just put on the playlist for this novel. It is unfortunately a little bit shorter than the actual act of reading it, but it's just kind of interesting to think about what the novel sounds like for the author as he's writing it. It's an interesting experience, but though I give it a 3 out of 5, it's not my favorite Murakami novel, and I think that you could skip it, honestly. If you're not someone that wants to read all of his works, you could skip this. It's the last day in Adelaide, and I am somehow ahead of the curve. I can't quite believe this happened either, but maybe this year I've just been a bit more strategic about the books I've chosen. Anyways, Siddhartha by Herman Hesse is a spiritual adventure novel. It is about one young man's journey to enlightenment by starting out as this Brahmin and being trained intellectually in spiritual ideas and realizing that he wants to experience the fullness of life and human experience. And so he ventures out into the world and he is tempted by various desires, and it causes him to have this big spiritual journey and discovery. He's aided and assisted by a number of really well-crafted characters, and I think the path of the story is really inspirational. I do think that if I was younger, this book would have really sent me down a path. But to me, this feels a lot like the author, who was raised Christian and was raised by missionaries, kind of grappling with the idea of morality in this world. And although that it's quite couched in Buddhist and Indian belief systems, I do think that the underlying logic about sin and temptation and righteousness has this oddly Christian undertone. And so I'm curious. I feel like this is an interesting starting point for me to look more into Eastern literature, but maybe not from one that's written from a Western lens. Like, it's funny to see this book become so popular, and I think it functions very well as a archetypal adventure and discovery story, and it is very inspirational. But I also don't know how much I trust it in terms of its representation of proper spirituality. I give it a 4 out of 5. I think it's a very enjoyable reading experience. The translation that I was using as well is just very easy to follow. The characters come across really clearly. I love Govinda, but everyone hopefully has a version of Govinda in their life. Appreciate everything. It's a fun read. In Watermelon Sugar by Richard Brautigan is the novel that I guess that Harry Styles song is named after, but it is so much weirder than that. It is about a sort of apocalyptic commune type society called iDeath, and they have these rituals around life and their surroundings, and they just have meals together, but everything is just a little bit strange and odd. It feels a bit science fiction-y, but it doesn't give you so much detail of the world for me to qualify it as science fiction. Like, it's so much more experimental than that. It's hard to tell what's real and what's not, what's dream and what's not. There's lots of little moments of jumping back and forth in time, but also the chapters themselves are so short, and they're written from the perspective of someone who doesn't tell us what their name is. They say that their name is not important, or like they're not the kind of person who has an easily understood name, but they talk about their life as if we would already understand it. Like, a lot of the stuff that happens in this book is very matter of fact, and so we need to kind of peek into the actual details to see that, oh, it actually really is really strange, and I don't really understand it. It feels like just a very strange dream. Not necessarily a bad dream, although some scary things do happen in it, but a strange dream. And for the length, like, it's only 20,000 or so words. It's just a short trip in an afternoon if you want to have your mind addled a little bit. And having read Siddhartha, I realized that I could just go on Gutenberg and read the old Nobel Prize winners if I really wanted to. I don't know if that's a challenge I want to do in my life, to read all the Nobel Prize winners. It's like 100, but A Treasure by Selma Lagerlof is a kind of a stylish Nordic thriller novel from 1904. I picked this up because this is the year that I need to finish for one of my other reading challenges. I haven't read a book from 1904 before. Selma Lagerlof is the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and she is mostly known for writing more moralistic books. I think A Treasure is not her most famous work, and it's very short. It's this kind of thriller story about a 1500s Swedish community and a group of Scottish robbers that come by and steal this treasure chest and actually kind of viciously murder the house of the people living in the house where the treasure chest is. We follow a visitor to the village who kind of doesn't witness the crime, but has this bad foreboding of the crime. And we also meet the only survivor, who is this housemaiden, and she swears this quest for revenge. It then becomes this really supernatural thriller type story that has its hints about morality and has its hints about justice and revenge, but really what's so strong about it is just the steps it takes for the characters to figure out the truth. Like, they're so close constantly to the actual murderers and to what actually happened. And it's the feeling of uncovering this injustice that's so heinous that it kind of threatens to reveal itself, which is really compelling in the story. I read it as this like really compulsive thriller novel, which I was impressed by for something from the early 1900s. But aside from that, I don't think the themes come across very clearly here, and perhaps I need to read a longer one of her novels to really get the full effect. I would give this a 3 out of 5. I enjoyed it the whole way through, but I don't think I would remember it ever again. And The Slip by Miriam Webster is a really cool set of short stories. So it's published by Aniko Press, who is this new publisher based in Sydney, and I am very excited to follow their work because I would love to also be a publisher one day. This is a set of short stories that I was kind of sold on being dark and surreal just based on this really fascinating cover and also the jacket quotes. Uncanny, electrifying debut, utterly original. Like, when I see things like that and I see like the design like this is very eye-catching, I assume that it's going to be a bit fantastical or a bit experimental, and I was surprised to find that these short stories really remind me of the kind of New Yorker stories of Ann Beattie or Laurie Moore, the kind of standalone stories about families and lost relationships that, to me, I think what's in common with this book and their work is that it really undermines or questions stability in romantic and marital relationships and instead looks towards the individual. And so we have a lot of characters who we see over the course of their entire life for a single short story, and that's very difficult to do, and I really celebrate this book for being able to do that very successfully. But when I read them, I find them very familiar. They use similar techniques and similar mechanisms to make the story work, and I feel the same having read one of these stories that I do having read like a really good Laurie Moore story. Like, towards the end, all the pieces fit together, I understand the characters more clearly for who they are, and that's great. But I also wonder, is it really a compliment to give an author to say, hey, your work is kind of indistinguishable from this writer that I really admire? I don't know. And I wonder kind of the identity of Australian fiction, if it's going to be compared to international writers stylistically. And the thing for me that makes this most distinctively Australian, aside from the swearing, like it uses the C word a bunch and whatever, but the setting, and it's a very Melburnian text. It has locations across Victoria and Melbourne, but primarily I found that I was recognizing the suburbs of Melbourne, and I was recognizing the kinds of behaviors and stereotypes that people see of Melbourne characters. And it's a bit richer than that. Like, it's not the most stereotypical depiction of a Melbourne person, but it is that kind of sleek and arty and stylish, aspiring writer, creative type character that we see most often in these stories. It's fine, like, it speaks the truth, it's okay. I give it 4 out of 5 just for how much I enjoyed these individual stories. Like, there's some really good stories in here. There is also, like, I think maybe 1 or 2 strange ones that offsets the overall tone, but as a collection, they feel familiar. They feel good, but they feel familiar. So I give them a 4 out of 5. We're back in Sydney again, and we are still one book ahead. The Bluest Eye is a book that I read on the flight from Adelaide to Sydney, which is about an hour and a half. So if you factor in runway time and flying through the air and then getting off and then waiting for bags, that's about 2 hours. So I think it's a bit unkind of me to read this book as fast as I did. I thought that the emotions that came through were really clear. Toni Morrison is an incredible author, and I've in the past had trouble connecting with her works. I think mainly because I guess I just didn't have as much knowledge of history and culture and of the civil rights movement and liberation for African American people as much as I do now. And I think having that access, I have a lot of sympathy for these characters here, but I also recognize that this is a book that's telling a very extreme situation. So we tend to follow the narration of 2 sisters who interact with this young girl named Pecola. And Pecola has been sexually assaulted by her father. And this kind of really sad situation is one where I think if conceptually this was the premise of a novel, you wouldn't necessarily read it, or if you read it, you would think that would err on the side of sensationalism. But I think for Morrison, the challenge that arises is that she does want to write about trauma experience within African American communities. And how can she do that in a way that doesn't just create sympathy, like doesn't just make the reader think, oh, this is such a terrible thing that happened, but actually make them feel the anger and the injustice that leads to this kind of thing. And I think thematically this book works really well to explain how affection and hatred are often mismatched when we look at situations of trauma and of institutionalized and ancestral injustice, where in a situation that is so fractured as African American communities were after the end of slavery and during the segregation era, bad things happened. And certainly how we process them and how we process the people that perpetrated them and the victims that suffered this, and then the kinds of things that go on to occur because of it, I think this book does a good job of explaining it. But it's also just a very harrowing reading experience that I think when I got to Beloved, when I read Beloved earlier a few years ago, I really felt the strong emotions of that, and it really connected to me in this deep, almost kind of wordless, it feels silly to say because we're talking about books, but wordless way that The Bluest Eye to me feels like it's approaching, but it's not quite there yet. So I give it a 4 out of 5. I really, really enjoyed the language here. I thought that the switching between the various character voices and the use of structure was really ingenious. Like, I think that it channeled the energy of the really negative events of this story in a way that was really informative and garnered a lot of empathy. I think the techniques used here are really interesting. And I don't want to intellectualize it in that way and just say that the choices made are very academic, although I think that Toni Morrison eventually has become an author that we study in academic contexts. But I think just to read as someone experiencing history and exploring history, I think it's very effective. Planet of Exile by Ursula Le Guin. So I can't believe that a full year ago I read Buchanan's World and I gave that 5 out of 5. Planet of Exile is the second novel in the Hainish series, which is a interplanetary sci-fi series about kind of like a interplanetary UN, like this big league of planets that are variously human, and the way they interact with colonies and other intelligent life forms across other planets. So this novel, Planet of Exile, is set on it's almost like a medieval world. Like, it's a world where there's not a lot of high technology and there is just military conflicts because of regionalism and tribalism. And because of that, I think the discussions of technology that I really like about the Hainish books are just not as strong here. Like, there is some discussion about the introduction and the advancement of technology and how that might lead to conflicts and things like that. But to me, this felt like kind of a middle book that was a bit world-buildy, and I would love to be the person that gives every Le Guin novel a 5 out of 5. I think she's an amazing author, and I really look forward to reading everything she's ever written. But Planet of Exile feels kind of middle of the ground for this series for me. Like, I love the Left Hand of Darkness, I loved Buchanan's World. This one I think is just kind of fleshing things out, but it's not going to be my favorite in the series. And lastly, Machines of Feelings. So I'm glad that I reviewed this in the same video that I reviewed The Bluest Eye, because this is a Australian novel. This is also a kind of traumatic childhood kind of story. We follow 3 children growing up in this care and foster home, and we have a very non-linear narrative of the way that each of these children, because of their various experiences and because, although it's not named in the novel itself, it is in the acknowledgements, their own experiences of autism, how that leads them to certain behaviors that distance themselves from, I guess, the wider adult world, but also let them see the world in new and interesting ways, and then draw them into one another, like create these strong bonds and connections and understandings with one another, because they do see the world in a way that doesn't align with anybody but each other. I think it's aiming for a mixture of sentimentality and beauty. I think that the actual writing of the sentences here is very classically beautiful in that they're very descriptive, there's lots of metaphors, it's quite poetic at times. But then I think about the representation of trauma in a book like this and the making of beauty by doing that. And I think, how is the reader positioned to view these characters who are distanced from society and are treated so unfairly and go through these really harrowing things? And I think this book doesn't quite structurally do as much for me as The Bluest Eye does. This book, it is non-linear, it does challenge the reader to try and figure out what's going on. It doesn't say things outright, and it doesn't feel like it's milking trauma for an immediate emotional response. And I've criticized books in the past for doing this, and this book doesn't feel like it's doing that at all. But it is still difficult for me to access on an emotional level. And when I do grasp what's going on and how these characters feel, I still have a little critical part of my mind that thinks, are we just taking the worst moments? Or are we just taking the most stark and the most extreme examples of characters like this and things they go through? And that makes it a little bit harder for me to connect with these characters on a human level. And I think maybe that's what I was thinking as I was reading this. I give it a 3 out of 5. I find it really interesting, the Australian works that approach topics like this, and following what books become successful and which ones are remembered. I found this in a used bookstore, and I mean, I don't not recommend it. I would say give it a go if you find it. But I also, it's not really something that I would see on a shelf today or talked about today. I think the author is very skilled, but I think she's written something more recently that's a bit more famous. I might put that on the screen. Human Acts by Han Kang is quite possibly one of the greatest books I have ever read and will ever read. I think for me, as someone who is not of Korean background and doesn't know a lot about the historical incident, the Gwonju Uprising, that inspired this novel, this book made me care so much for the innocent people that were hurt and killed by state violence in that situation. And in this current world and context where I wonder about where the world is headed politically and how we look at the future and look at the hope that could exist in our lives, I think this book, it made me see things about the world and our situation that I'd never considered on that level before. And it's just so incredible. It was an easy 5 out of 5, despite the really harrowing subject matter, and there's some really, really dark scenes in here. I would recommend it to everyone. I think I feel like a more careful and delicate person having read this. I think I view human life in a different way, which is a huge amount of praise for a book that's about 200 pages that I read so quickly. But my gosh, it is a very powerful read. The way that it's written is incredible. Just everything about it to me is just beyond what I could fathom a novel could do. It is truly, truly incredible. Crying in the office break room kind of reading experience. All right, it is the 28th. We did it. It's done. Between the Acts by Virginia Woolf is a book that I would really not recommend reading in one day. I don't think I would recommend any Virginia Woolf novel in one day, even the shortest one, the one published after her passing. I think this book is an interesting look into a particular time and place. So it's written after the start of World War II, but it's about British life kind of in between the two wars, between the acts. And structurally, it's about a British large kind of extended household that go to watch a play for this gala, and it's celebrating British or English culture. They look at Elizabethan styles of drama. It's very Shakespearean at first, and then looking at how the English identity evolves over time. And this book, I find, more so than any of Woolf's other works, I find to be very interesting in the way that it's critiquing English culture. It's not a book that rests on the power of the English Empire or anything. Instead, it acknowledges the colonial attitudes of Britain within India and also the classism within English society. And it shines a light on that, but it doesn't celebrate or, I guess, ignore it. Instead, there is a real discomfort here about questions of class and questions of inherited wealth and whether people really deserve this, and also whether they deserve to be just relaxing and having their quiet time when the country is about to be plunged into war as well. I think this is pretty interesting, although it is a very hard read. It is even less plot than most Virginia Woolf novels are. There's not really even a thing that happens in this book. You just meet characters and you see them watch this play. But idea-wise, I think it does both resonate with Woolf's larger body of work in an interesting way, but also say some really needed to say things towards the end of, well, I guess I mean towards the middle of the 20th century and of Britain's place in the wider world. I would give it a 3 out of 5. I would not recommend this unless you are a huge fan of Woolf or you're particularly looking to the historical period, but if you are, I think it's a pretty valuable text. Broken Words by Helen Hodgman is a very, very strange book, and it's one that I'm surprised to be talking about. I got this book from a mystery box from a bookstore, and it's one of those books where I think if I saw this on a shelf, I wouldn't know who the author was, I wouldn't know what the context is, and I wouldn't know what to expect. So it is a very strange, surreal book about 20 or so different characters that are roughly connected. Largely, there's no central gravitational thing in the story, which makes it really hard to read, and not something that I enjoy reading in a day. It follows... Well, it's really, really hard to describe. Like, if you look at the back, it's got all the characters. Moss wants to go shopping, Elvis wants an aquarium, Harold wants to start his own religion, Princess Anne might want to be left out of it, Angst wants to know where his next meal is coming from, Walter, Daphne, Rupert, Manny, Maureen, Sue, Beulah, Buster, Hitler, the Boogeyman, Le Professeur de Judo, Renate, Hazel, and that's not even all the named characters in this book. That's only about 120 pages long, well, that's 190 pages long. It is wild. It is about same-sex couples in surprisingly, I think the 1970s. So it's one of the earlier queer texts, 1980s, sorry. One of the earlier queer texts in Australian literary history, and it's gotten, unfortunately, forgotten to time. I don't know what it's trying to do. I don't really know what character I'm supposed to focus on. I don't really know what it's trying to say about a society, other than there is a complexity and often sometimes darkness to it. And there aren't really any fairy tale endings in this Australian or global suburban life anymore, that our relationships are always going to be a bit strained and a bit struggling against the history of our failed connections. Which, I mean, to fight against your expected nuclear family story is fine, but gosh, it's hard to get into this. And yet, it's a book that I wish wasn't lost. It's a book that I actually hope someone can find more easily, because Helen Hodgman is a really influential Australian author who is now basically you would not be able to find one of her books new in a bookstore anymore. She's just fallen out of print. So I would give it a 3 out of 5. Read it, think about what it means, I guess, discuss it. It's not a good time, but it is also really distinctive in what it's trying to do. Fighting Back by Vivian Cleven is a novel from a First Nations author published in 2001. And this is kind of hard to talk about, so I feel like the amount of cultural change that's happened in the last 25 years is immense. And so a narrative about a young Aboriginal man who one day decides to wear a dress and call himself Jean Rees, that's played for comedy. I think when this book came out in 2001, it was totally fine culturally to make jokes at the expense of transgender identities or just playing with ideas of masculinity and femininity. And a lot of that today feels kind of like punching down. So I think there is a little hurdle to get over at the beginning of this book, but I kept reading and I thought that the narrator, so the narrator is actually the mother of the character who is the young man who is choosing to change his identity. The mother is a really lovingly written figure. It's someone who, even though she is very discouraging towards, her son's name is Neville, towards Neville adopting this name of Jean Reese and choosing to wear a dress. It's also not entirely clear what this is, by the way. It's kind of framed as a mystery. No character really understands what's happening, whether it is Neville coming out as transgender or whether it is something else. Like, it's not really clear. And the structure of the novel is actually to figure out why he's doing this. But the narrator is just a very flawed person, but a very loving person. And so even though she really tries hard to stop her son from doing what she thinks is I guess wrong, her motivations are grounded in the fact that she recognizes that her town will not accept him. And so it's done in this kind of painful altruism that she's trying to save him from being physically attacked by his rugby team or the opposing rugby team that would take more exception to his decision with his identity. So then this book kind of develops, and Jean Reese, of course, the famous post-colonial author that wrote White Suck Sea, it discusses the notions of identities within small towns with high Aboriginal populations, of masculinity as being railroaded into certain roles. And for what it's worth, like, there's this really subtle feminism in the story where it's very cognizant of the way that gender consigns people to roles. And it's interesting how it actually chooses to speak more about masculine expectations and masculine roles within these small towns than it does with feminine ones. It talks about how constraining it is for men to be expected to fight, but also to be responsible family-wise, and how ruptures of these expectations are only really, or especially painful, because society is so homogenizing, because it forces people to do that. And despite all of this, it is still a very light and comedic novel. It's also a community novel. Like, you really get to know these characters, and even after reading just 50 pages, the named characters feel so familiar to me, which kind of lessens the blow of the homophobia, really. It doesn't feel like you're in danger very much, at least until the plot gets going. And even then, the discussions feel responsible. They don't feel like they are particularly punching down on anybody. So overall, I still kind of enjoyed this book. I think the dialogue is really snappy and the characters are really well done. I would give it a 4 out of 5. And it's also a very landmark book in terms of First Nations authors. Hopefully this is easy to find anywhere. And yeah, it's great. And lastly, number 28, The Fish Girl by Miranda Riwo is about it's a retelling of a W. Somerset Maugham story, which you can kind of actually ignore, because although the epigraphs are from that short story, and it's about wealthy British people in then colonial Indonesia, really this book is about a young girl who's caught up in all of that colonial narrative. So she's from this small village, and her parents, her name's Mina. The novel's very clear about naming her and giving her this personality. Her family decides to trade her into labor with this Dutch merchant in the hopes that it would give her a better life and also their family a better life. And so we follow her story, learning to live within the life of this Dutch trader named Julius, and just experiencing the world in a way that expands and opens up her worldview coming from the small village. They eat food and live life in a way that she had never comprehended before. And we get to see kind of what it would be like to be young and discovering the world open up so dramatically. At the same time, she's still very connected to local spiritual beliefs and to her identity. And she seems to have this skin condition which reads like eczema. And I've never read a novel that has a character with eczema in it as a plot device. So it was really kind of funny to see my everyday discomfort rendered in a way like this book. And I mean, it's not a fun story. It's definitely a dramatic story. And we see the consequences of colonialism, but also patriarchy from both the Western and the Indonesian voices that make Mina's life difficult. And that balance, I think, is pretty well struck. We do have some very stark moments here, but we also have some moments of really surprising beauty. And in a very short amount of time, I think I had all my emotions kind of laid out to contemplate. So I would give it a 4 out of 5. It is a very worthy winner of the Novella Prize, I think of 2017. So Seizure Viva Novella 2017. Not that long ago, but yeah. It's so funny because I was like self-conscious that I would not have a big stack by the end of this month because I'd read so many ebooks. And now looking at my stack, I'm a bit nervous to kind of pick it all up. Ugh. All right. Okay, so it's this many and a bunch of ebooks. My reads for February. I think the main thing that I've learned this month, having done this challenge, I'm going to put it down, it's too heavy. Having done this challenge for the 3rd or 4th time now, I think it's the 4th time, is that I started this channel thinking I would be very critical and thinking I would not fall into this pattern of overly loving reading, of saying that reading is so important and it's this like life-changing experience. But having read as much as I have this month and just seeing how much I enjoyed each of these books for what it was, and also being able to make so many connections from things I've read previously to books that I'm reading now, it is really cool. I'm really, really enjoying just about everything. Like, I don't think I gave a single 2 out of 5 this entire month. There's going to be a lot of 3 out of 5s and 4 out of 5s. I'm so sorry for people that actually want recommendations because this is not going to help. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I think I will do this again next year. I will probably want to schedule my sleeping and everything better. My skin's really taking a dive. But aside from that, like, it's fun. Give it a shot. Or do a more reasonable challenge. Maybe something like, I don't know, whatever's reasonable to you. But reading more is a good thing, and I can't believe I'm saying that. Almost forgot to do my top 3. So number 3, and this one I think I'm moving down a little bit just because I've talked about it a lot before. Breakfast at Tiffany's is a lovely, lovely book. It is a novella that I think I'll keep returning to just because the characters are so fun. The writing style is really just gentle and warm, and it's not a sad book. Like, some sad things happen in it, but I would not say this is a primarily sad book. It's a book about really getting to know somebody and really seeing the world in an optimistic light. And even when that causes you to act in some strange ways or transgress in some kind of social decorum, it is still about characters that are so bright in the world. So I really enjoy this, and I think I will come back to it every couple of years. Number 2, The Swimmers by Julie Otsuka is just a wonderfully crafted book. I think the way that this uses its structures and its perspectives and just the way that it's written is really beautiful. It helped me think so much more deeply about the people in my life that I care about, especially the people of generations older than I am. Just being compassionate and being able to see what brings people joy and brings people sorrow, and also recognize the vulnerabilities in our bodies that we all kind of share. I think all of this is done really well. And lastly, number 1, Human Acts. I'm still reeling from this novel. I don't understand how Han Kang can do this, but a book that helps me recognize so much about our shared humanity and also what to do, how to respond in the face of such great tragedy, and that feeling of like not knowing what to do in the world, not knowing what your purpose is in the face of so much suffering. And yet, you know, like, things that, what can I say? Like, things in this book are just so meaningful. You just have to read it and see how it works. This is the 3rd Han Kang novel I've read, and the 2nd 5 out of 5 that I've given her. Just a fantastic work. Emotionally just devastating, but also like not in a way that feels like it's trying to make me cry. Not in a way that it feels disingenuous or exploitative. And in fact, that's really a theme of this book, is how can you write about tragedy, and what is the purpose of being an author and connecting yourself to things like this? and it answers it. It finds a really, really meaningful answer. So just a really amazing read, and hopefully the more people that read this, the more compassion we'll see in the world. So yes, absolutely, number one, so glad they read this. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll be back next month with usual categories. All right, see yous.